Hi everybody, I am Hillary Larman. I am the manager for community engagement here with UNICEF USA. Throughout the morning, you have heard a variety of topics addressing things impacting people here in Chicago and globally. And the intersectional issue of gender-based violence is similar in that it's experienced all around the world. Adolescent girls disproportionately lack access to an education and are more likely to be exposed to certain harmful practices such as child marriage and female genital mutilation or cutting, and are vulnerable to trafficking. Gender discrimination, norms, and practices mean that adolescent girls are also likely to experience certain forms of violence, such as sexual violence at higher rates. UNICEF and its partners work in communities addressing 4 gender priorities: violence and emergencies, girls to secondary education, ending child marriage, and promoting girls' health. UNICEF has provided multi-sectoral gender-based violence programming to more than 430,000 children. These services include health, psychosocial and livelihood support, economic strengthening, and access to justice. Similarly, our next speaker is engaging women locally and globally by upskilling and empowering women to harness the power of storytelling and their unique selves to enact policy and social change. Anne Green is a Chicago-based writer and the founder of the Voices and Faces Project, an award-winning storytelling project created to bring the names, faces, and testimonies of gender-based violence survivors to the attention of the public. Her 2014 memoir, Lived Through This, documents her time spent listening to the survivors of sexual violence and trafficking. She has received numerous awards for her work, including the Susan Estrich Courage Award and the End Violence Against Women International Visionary Award. Thank you so much for being here. So I wanted to get started by hearing a little bit more about how this project took formation. After hearing from the survivors and writing your book, what really inspired this project?
The impetus for the project was actually really personal. I'm a survivor of violence myself, and I always sort of laughingly say that some of the younger women on our project now have a hard time remembering that there was actually a time when to publicly talk about sexual violence was not only frowned upon, but in a lot of ways made you vulnerable. And I, at the time that I lived through violence, was living in Washington, D.C., and I remember going back to work at a male-dominated lobbying firm on K Street. There were a handful of women there, and looking around the room and thinking, if I knew just one woman in this room who had gone through what I'd gone through and was talking about it, I'd breathe a huge sigh of relief, knowing that there was a place for me in a future. And that really was the impetus for the project. You know, years and years later, I wanted to go out and start listening to survivors, and it was as much about documenting their stories as it was about listening to them and learning from them. And I think one of the things that was most important and compelling for me was to really go into the world and listen to women and find the wisdom in women that was unique to them in their regions, but that was also universal. And to be able to make connections between the experiences of women and children across the globe, and also to recognize the uniqueness of what goes on in different regions. And after working on that project, one of the things I heard most often was women saying, yes, I'd love to be in your book. I'd love to be a part of what you're doing at the Voices and Faces Project. But I'm also really interested in writing my own story. And so one of my long-standing colleagues, who's an amazing novelist and writer and came out of Iowa Writers Workshop, said, what if we created a testimonial writing program? And that has now become our signature project. In fact, I see a few alums in the audience.
Wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about the workshop process and how someone might go through the program to be able to tell their story?
Yeah, one of the really exciting things about the workshop is we really structured it around the idea that it was a space for people who had lived or witnessed violence. So the vast majority of people in that room have survived violence, but there are also family members, witnesses, aid workers, people who have stories to tell about the human rights violations that are going on everywhere. And people want to reflect on how to tell a personal story in a way that illuminates a broader political truth. So we start by doing a lot of advanced reading. We read writing from Reverend King, Primo Levi, Cynthia Ozick, a body of really amazing writers that we kind of shift out with each workshop. And in the workshop, we talk about what we can learn from social justice advocates who have written and spoken across history and across social justice movements. And then in the second day, spend a lot of time reflecting on how to write and share our own stories. And as my colleague always says, the co-part of the program says, creating ways for people to think differently about storytelling. So whether it's memoir, poetry, an op-ed, a young adult novel, whatever your passion is, how do you marry that passion to a medium that allows you to really tell your story in an effective way? So it's as much a serious writing workshop as it is an advocacy training in a lot of ways.
Great, and that really brings me to my next point. And when we talked before, we talked a lot about how people use this as a public way to really speak to public officials or share their stories to create this policy change. How do you ensure that the right people are in the room to hear these stories?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I assume you mean the right people, meaning the audience.
Yes.
One of my favorite experiences when we first brought the testimonial writing program to South Africa, we did an immersive program that was actually, our usual writing workshop is 2 days. This was a 10-day program, and we had a community of women and girls from South Africa who had survived sexual violence, trafficking, intimate partner violence, in some cases war crimes. And these women had never really spoken publicly about their stories, but they have really powerful stories to tell because they had seen the two major institutions in their country, the African National Congress and the Anglican Church, the two institutions that were most pivotal, some would argue, in tearing down apartheid. Those same institutions, these women felt, were failing to address gender-based violence and violence against women. And at the time we were there, South Africa was being called the rape capital of the world. And so part of our job was to create an immersive writing program where the women in the room could really reflect on how they wanted to speak to their stories, what they wanted to say, when they didn't want to speak, and kind of structure it so that it was their program. But the other part of our job was to get that audience there. So working with our partners on the ground, we reached out to major figures in the Anglican Church and the AMC. We had Bishop Tutu's heir, Bishop Margaret, was there, and we brought all these people into Durban, South Africa to hear these stories. And I still remember seeing the looks on these people's faces when they not only were exposed to facts and statistics, but when they had women and girls standing up and saying, I am a manifestation of what is happening in this country. The violence that we're not addressing, I live in it, and I live with the consequences of it. And it was hard to find a dry eye in that space. And so, to your point and to your question, as much as it matters that we speak out, I think it also is extraordinarily important that advocates and allies work really hard to get opinion shapers, policymakers, folks who can actually contribute to creating change in the rooms to hear these stories, and then honor the survivor voices when those leaders are in the room.
Thank you. And we know that many of these norms are really cultural and community-based. How do you tackle some of these ideological issues that can be really pervasive?
It's always it's a hard question. It was really hard when we first founded this project because it was early and, again, hard to imagine, relatively early in the life of the internet. And so as we were working on this book, we were also digitally sharing stories. And early on, we recognized that we were, in a sense, outsourcing through the internet a mode of openness that has its own risks in the US. You know, if you come forward and you speak out, you may deal with some consequences or some blowback, professionally or personally, and you may, in fact, be at risk. But when someone speaks out in a country where naming your rapist may make you a target of a murder, or outing a family member makes you uniquely vulnerable, that creates some complicated ethical questions for documentarians and storytellers. And so I think one of the things that we talk a lot about, and we talk about this in the writing workshop as well, is the degree to which we want to explore and talk about risk, acknowledge risk, be really clear on what risks are when we make decisions about where to tell a story, or when someone comes forward and says, I want to share a story. But in the end, once we do that, I remember another project we worked on was in Atenco, Mexico. Women of Atenco who had been the victims of sexual violence at the hands of federal, state, and local police officers. And they were naming names, and they wanted to name names, and they named names all the way up to the president of the country. And when we came down there, it was relatively early. Now their story has become much more prominent. They still have not had full justice, by the way. And this was 2006. But they knew that the risk was extraordinary. And not that we would wish you could not talk them out of coming forward. And there was a group of 4 or 6 of them who were particularly vocal and open. And one of them, Claudia, I still remember her saying, if they do something to us, we'll go away, but our stories now will never go away. And that, I think, is really beautiful. I mean, stories have a life of their own, and they're immortal. And so when we put our words out into the world, we've given a really beautiful gift to the world. And I think we've also given a lasting gift to the world. So those cultural differences, we have to be fully aware of them. And in the end, sometimes when someone says, I want to do this is my gift to the world, we get out of the way.
Thank you. Talking about cultural differences, have you seen or observed any kind of difference in the way these projects run in Chicago versus around the world?
That's a really interesting question. I love the panel that preceded us. And I was thinking a lot as they were talking about, we bring the writing workshop to the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center in Chicago. And one of the things I'm struck by more than difference is actually similarity. And when the girls in that workshop in Chicago have talked about the police brutality they've experienced, the discrimination, the educational indifference, and the complex factors that often have led them to the JTDC. I was struck when we were recently in Nairobi with a group of young girls that they talked about a set of different but related cultural factors. You know, girls not mattering, their education's not mattering. They're being seen as lesser because of the color of their skin, depending on the community they're in. And so in some ways, especially with the workshop we do for youth, there's something about young people that's incredibly universal. When we walked in the room with the 20 girls we were with recently in Nairobi, who were, by the way, 20 of the most joyous, passionate, engaged girls I've ever worked with, who in some ways were arguably the most traumatized population I've ever worked with. They had all lost their families and were refugees. I was really struck when we walked in the room that the sound in the room was not unlike the sound when we walk in a room full of girls in Chicago. You heard exuberance, you heard laughter, you felt their slight bit of anxiety because this was the first, I don't know, if you've been in Kenya, they were being educated in a very British model, and this writing workshop is very interactive. It's all about sharing your feedback and input, and the girl said that was the first time someone had said, no, I want to know what you think about that piece. What's your opinion on it? And so you could feel there's like anxiety around that dissipated, but mostly you could see the power of being young and the potential for rebuilding and the resiliency, and that to me is most universal.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about how you have seen public discourse change through an example of one of the experiences in the project?
Yeah, there have been so many. I think one of the most striking was, and this comes back to a Chicago story, Brenda Myers-Powell, who is a survivor of trafficking and prostitution, and she entered the sex trade when she was a young girl. And Brenda has shared her story not only with our project, but over time more broadly. You know, she's in my book that's being adapted to a play. There's a documentary about her. And what you saw in Illinois was the power and force of Brenda's stories alongside the stories of a community of women who had been sexually exploited become so loud and so powerful, alongside some really impassioned activists, that they played a critical role in changing law in Illinois. Illinois is actually on the forefront and seen as a model in terms of being a state that addresses sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And so watching many of these women who are really extraordinary began to speak, and then began to speak more and more forcefully, and they become advocates I would take in the room on any issue, not just the issue they had lived through. It's really powerful, and it says something about, again, finding spaces for people to share their stories, and then taking those stories and bringing them to the attention of the public that when they hear them, will demand change.
Great, and you're talking a little bit about community and how women are able to even advocate for others who might not have lived through the same circumstance. How have you seen community partners and community relations really play into pushing this issue forward?
I mean, for me, working on this issue, and especially with our testimonial writing program, we always work with the community on the ground, or a whole group of local organizations. And what I've seen when we did our South Africa project, we were working with an organization called Tear Fund, which is actually a faith-based organization that connects basically people of faith to the 40 most at-risk countries. And what I've seen in working with partners like that, and on the ground at Refuge, which is another one of our partners, that's another Chicago-based organization, or the school in Nairobi that we partner with, is that there are things that our local partners know that we don't know, can never know in the same way someone on the ground can know in terms of lived experience. And that if we enter into these partnerships when we go in a community, not just showing up and saying, we're here with our writing program, but beginning the dialogue with the community months or weeks earlier. In the case of our writing workshop, in some cases, we'll be talking to the folks on the ground a year earlier. And that process of not only coming and bringing the work you do in the community, but recognizing that you're coming out of that community with a huge amount of knowledge and understanding that you would not otherwise have when you've been welcomed into a community is key. And I just don't think with a project like our writing workshop, we would never do this project outside of community. You know, in some of the regions we've gone to, we've had up to 12 partners on the ground, organizations that then go to their members and their communities and say, this is something you might be interested in. This is something we think could be powerful. We could never do that effectively. We wouldn't have the local authority, and we wouldn't want to do it that way. And one of the really exciting things for me is actually working in the field and the extraordinary bonds that you forge. And that only happens when you really enter into that communal space with an openness to community.
Thank you. Well, we're just getting ready to open to Q&A, but I have one more question. I would love to hear about a story that really inspires you and that keeps you motivated to continue to do this work.
I think I told you this earlier, that it's so hard to choose one story because there have been so many stories that I keep in my heart and that have really moved me. But one was a young woman who was in one of our writing workshops in Canada. It was a young woman from an Indigenous community. And that workshop, we had a lot of people coming out of that workshop who were doing some really extraordinary things. You know, they were publishing op-eds, they were speaking out, they were lobbying. But I remember hearing from this young woman who said, for the first time since I took part in this writing workshop, I was able to articulate to my family what had happened to me. And I remember thinking that was just about the most powerful outcome that I ever heard, knowing her community, knowing her story, knowing the challenges she was facing. So in some ways, you know, sometimes the bigger stories, like the writers who come to the program who publish a young adult novel or an op-ed in the New York Times or whatever it may be, those are the stories that funders tend to like and that get a lot of heat, that get a lot of attention. But that story for me was why we do what we do. You know, how can we create a space where someone is confident and comfortable bearing witness to their own history and brings it into even the most intimate spaces where I think sometimes the change is actually the most necessary.
Thank you. Well, does anybody have any questions?
Good question. I'm curious how you fund your program and, you know, what kinds of organizations fund you? Can you repeat the question?
The question was, who funds you and what types of organizations are funding this project?
So we have a handful of really great local foundations that fund us in Chicago that folks would probably be very familiar with, and two larger national foundations. One is Novo Foundation, which has been really wonderful, and they've been very supportive. But many of our workshops are funded by partners on the ground. So a community sees the workshop and says, how do we raise the money to bring this to the community? Another really wonderful thing that we have with the program, because our workshops, once you're accepted in the workshop, they're always free programs. But we have a program called Give It Forward, where we just say to our alums, if in any way you want to get involved in supporting this, feel free. And so many of our alums will scholarship a single writer. One of our alums that published a young adult novel took the entire advance and funded a writing workshop, actually in Chicago. So people who have taken part in the program have historically played a really large role in bringing that particular program, which is really the organization's signature program.
And you just have can individuals other than alums contribute? Can any
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, if you get on voicesandfaces.org, you can absolutely donate.
Other questions?
I'm curious if you could tell us more about the advocacy piece. So you have the women telling their story and then turning this into advocacy. Can you tell me more about that, about how they become advocates?
Yes. The testimonial writing program is structured in such a way that we talk a lot and look at examples of really effective social justice advocates across history and social movements. So part of what we do in that workshop is really develop strategies for how do you use your story to create change? How does the language you choose break down barriers as opposed to put up walls? What are aspects of your own story that could actually move the needle in terms of public understanding? So we talk a lot about that in the program, but then what we do really actively at the Voices and Faces Project is identify places where people need to understand these issues and support our writers or our project members in getting out there. So we've had members lobby on Capitol Hill, in Springfield, in state houses across the country. We work to help place an op-ed if they have an op-ed. We'll get them in front of community groups. And then we are very focused on identifying policy opportunities. So, for example, when the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act was up, we knew that there were, I believe at the time, I want to make sure I get this right, 5 states where there were senators who might be wavering. And we were actually able to find members of the Voices and Faces Project in those 5 states who were survivors. And they came forward to share their stories, and we did that both with them speaking out publicly, but also in creating a web portal through the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, where policymakers would be exposed to these stories. And that's a way of really digging deep and saying, here's where we know we have a gap in this state, and here's the story, and someone willing to share it that might shift the needle on policy.
Other questions? Okay, well, I have a couple more. You were talking about how one of the biggest things for advocacy is really connecting with people and creating public understanding. What do you think is the biggest disconnect that you have to tackle when you're trying to address large groups of people?
One of the really moving things about the moment we're in now is that, at least for the first time since I've been doing this work, the broader public versus those of us who have always been passionate about gender justice and social justice is talking about sexual violence and intimate partner violence and workplace sexual violence and harassment. And that's thanks to Me Too and Time's Up and a long community of women who came before Me Too and Time's Up, of course, because many of my own mentors have been speaking out for decades. But I think sometimes all of the energy and heat around the movement, which is really important, can blind us to the fact that you can still go into a community. I was actually just in the Ozarks last week, and you can still go into communities where no matter what's happening in the media or in the broader public, people still are not comfortable coming forward. They're still not comfortable speaking out. They're still experiencing this workplace sexual harassment and don't feel, despite all of the noise that to them, they would say it's noise, all that noise is not making them feel they can come forward. So I think one of our biggest challenges is bringing our work into communities where people still do not feel that this movement is for them, and really actively connecting those voices to the movement. And that means alliances, new alliances. It means partnering with folks on the ground we have not partnered with previously. And in some cases, it means breaking through your own ideological barriers. Our organization is nonpartisan. I am one of the people more on the left end of the spectrum in our organization. And early in our project, I spoke at Wheaton College. For anyone who's familiar with Wheaton, it's seen as the Christian Harvard in the center of the evangelical movement in some ways. And so one of your challenges in a situation like that is to be able to bring your very clear values and ideology in the room and not waver on that, and challenge people in that room to think about how the patriarchy, or white male privilege, or certain notions of what it means to be a woman have put women in that community at risk. You have to be able to speak that truth, but find a language that people in that room, that will allow people in that room to be more open. So the language that I used was that this is a moral values issue. This is a family values issue. If you're an ethical person or an ethical church and you're not addressing this issue, you're not ethical. And so those words, which are not usually the words I'd use, I'd usually be talking up my angry feminism as much as I could. But those were the words that resonated. So I think part of what we also have to do is recognize communities we need to get into, to create change, and find the language that breaks through barriers while we remain really true to our fierce ideology.
Thank you. We have a whole room full of advocates and people who are eager to take action. Can you talk a little bit about what can people in this room do to address the issue of gender-based violence in their communities?
There's so much you can do, and actually, I do hope if you get on our website, you'll learn a lot more about very, very specific things that can be done. But the first thing I'd say coming out of a day like today is take the story that you've heard and move it into your world. If every single one of us takes something we've heard today and goes back to our family or our community or our workplace and says, this is what I've heard, and this impacted me, and that's why, it can be extraordinarily powerful. I think the second thing that we do talk a lot about in our writing program is have the courage to be uncomfortable. Meaning when you hear the rape joke, you see the harassment, you're at a table where someone says something that's not quite right, but you seem to be the only person who thinks it's not quite right. Have the courage to be uncomfortable and challenge that. Because for too long, the people doing the challenging have been the people directly affected by the injustice. And that's a heavy, heavy weight to carry. And then the final thing when we go into this election season, because there are so many pressing issues that many of us are really passionate about, is how do we elevate the conversation about gender-based violence and make clear its connection to other social injustices, because it is connected to racial injustices, economic injustices, educational injustices, all of those things. So we need to be able to hold our policymakers accountable. And then a fourth thing, if I can have a fourth, is for anyone in this room who's interested, we would love to have you consider applying for the testimonial writing program. So get on voicesandfaces.org and find out more about that.
Great, thank you. Just lastly, is there anything that you want to leave the room with to really inspire them to take action?
I think your own power. I mean, I have seen people, I think again of what happened in South Africa. I've seen people who have never spoken out about their own experience with gender-based violence or had never been actively engaged in advocacy. Not only change the minds of extraordinarily powerful people, but go forward and become really activists. One of the quietest young women, she was a refugee from Rwanda who was in South Africa, incredibly quiet during our workshop. And even when she spoke in front of the community she spoke in front of, was still very quiet. And I just talked to someone on the ground about 6 months ago, and she basically said to me, Yvette has become the major and main organizer around this issue of gender-based violence in Durban, South Africa. And that's 4 years later. So I don't know what that journey was, but I know I want to go on something like that, and I know we can all go on it, so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.